This is Luke Turner, back with episode 5 of Building a Web App from Scratch. So today I have a quick update before we start. I've been trying to avoid doing things off camera, so to speak, working on the app in my downtime. But one thing that I have done is I've added a notes file here, notes.md. And this is kind of a common thing that I'll do with my apps. I'll be thinking about it a little bit in the shower or just like as I'm going through my day, as I'm taking a walk, and I'll write down some notes, even if I'm not planning on actually doing anything with those notes right away. And this notes.md file is added to my git ignore. So that's actually the only commit that I've done since the last stream. Nothing major. But in this notes.md, I'm kind of listing a few of the new features that I think we're going to want to add or new functionalities that we'll want to add to the app. And this can kind of guide me when I'm actually getting started on work to figure out what I want to work on next. One of the things that I think I particularly want to work on today is this parameterizing exercises, because this is going to be an important feature basically throughout the whole app. And kind of the idea here, well, let me actually get started first. Just going to copy these commands. Start with this one, then this one, then a new tab, and this one. And then once this loads, okay, I can open my app. Okay. So what we're looking at here is the today view. And in this view, users can log their exercises for the day. But suppose I have an exercise that's like dumbbell curl, right? And then suppose it's today and I want to log dumbbell curls. It's like, well, I did 5 curls. But what I can't include in this information is what the actual weight of dumbbells I was using is. And if we look back at the notes here, there's sort of 4 types of parameters that occurred to me here. There's weight, like for that dumbbell curl example. There's assistance, which is negative weight, like if you're doing an assisted pull-up. And although they're both units of, pounds or kilograms, they should be treated differently by the app. If you're rendering a graph, weight would be going from low to high on the y-axis, whereas assisted weight, you'd probably want to go from high to low. Maybe not. I guess it depends on how you want it to look. But either way, I think tracking these separately is probably a good thing. Distance is another parameter. Like say I have a run. When we did our schema for sets, we included a duration. So I could say, well, I went on a 20-minute run. But how far did I go? And how fast did I go? Those are sort of 2 sides of the same coin, right? If I know the duration and I know the distance, then I can calculate the average speed. Alternatively, if I know the duration and the average speed, I can calculate the distance. As a user, what you're probably going to know is the distance. Like if you're using a GPS tracker or, you plan on doing a 2-mile run, you're just going to go 2 miles. And then based on the duration, this app can calculate your average speed for you. So speed doesn't need to be one, but distance does need to be a parameter. And then finally, there's some types of exercises where it's a little bit more vague. Like for instance, suppose you're doing a stretch, or suppose you're doing some kind of cardio thing. And it's like maybe there's a low intensity, maybe there's a high intensity. I guess an example might be like swimming or like, yeah, I don't know. Not entirely sure. But I feel like there's this kind of general intensity where it would just be like low, medium, high. And that could be used as a parameter as well. And kind of the idea here is we want people to be able to say, okay, for this exercise dumbbell curl, it should be parameterizable by weight. So the user should be able to specify a weight for the set of the dumbbell curl. So what does that look like? Well, we know we're going to need some more data in the set. And we could do this as a JSON-B structure, a single column where it's like parameterized values or something like that. Or if we're confident that we're going to have a limited number of parameterized values, we could do each one as a column. I don't really have a strong preference here, but my feeling is that doing it as a JSON-B object might be a little bit more future-proof. As we add more parameterized values, we can just update that without needing to add new columns. And the user could, in theory, add their own parameterized values. Like if those 4, weight, assistance, duration, and intensity, or distance and intensity, aren't enough for them, maybe they want to have their own custom ones. Well, obviously you couldn't do that if it was stored in explicit columns per parameter type. So if we use a JSON structure, we can allow that to work. But we also need to update the exercise table itself, wherever that is, up here. Because the exercise is going to determine what parameters are configurable for that given set, if that makes sense. So the dumbbell curl will only be parameterized by weight. You wouldn't have intensity for that. Or maybe you would, but that's a setting that would be configured on that particular exercise. So let's start with that. Let's make something called parameters. And I guess kind of a word about why I'm using the word parameter here. Basically what this is it's allowing the user to include additional information alongside their set. So it's not just, oh, hi. It's not just the raw data of how many reps you did, but it also is including additional information. So let's look at the Drizzle spec here. As usual, got to get into the docs for a library that I've never used before. And we're going to try to see how we can define a JSON-B structure in here. Seems pretty simple. So basically, these parameters, this is going to be a JSON-B object. And import that. And let's see if we can define, okay, there's a default. It's not very useful for me for this particular thing. And I can do a type. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Let's go ahead and do that. Type. And this can be a record, string, and string or number. And so what we're saying here is that what we're putting in this JSON-B object is an object, because the JSON-B type, it could be an array, it could be a single value. In this case, it's an object where the keys are strings and the values are either a string or a number. And maybe we would have some kind of more, yeah, you too. Maybe we would have a more complex type in this value, but for now, let's just go with this. And because this is something that's not actually going to be ending up in the migration at all, we can change this type whenever we want. Okay, and then for the sets, each set is going to also have something which I guess I'll also just call parameters. Technically, these are values for the parameter, so I probably should use a different term if I want it to be really specific. In programming language terms, these would be more like the arguments to the set, but I'm just going to call them parameters as well for consistency. And this is also going to be an object. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, this parameters is an object. This one up here, where we're actually defining the parameters, feels like more of an array. Let's just make this a string array. And kind of the idea here is that this would be, duration, weight. Maybe this needs to be more than a string. Let's make a type. Parameter definition. And so here we would have, say, the name of the parameter, the ID of the parameter, perhaps, although we'll have to decide if we actually want to have separate names and IDs or not. And then also, say, the data type of the parameter. And this could be, maybe it could be like a weight or distance or intensity. Let's just start there. And we'll have to see how much these types start making sense when we're actually building the app, building the UI for these. But for now, we can start with this. And so having run this now, if I open up a new tab here, I can create a migration based on the change that I just made to the schema file. Let's see what that did. So we're adding 2 columns, and that's pretty much it. Exercises add column, alter table sets add column. They're both type JSON-B. And let's go ahead, let's collapse this a bit. Let's go ahead and commit these changes. Add parameters, columns to sets and exercises table. Cool. Sorry, I was just looking through the chat a little bit. I'm probably not going to do a good job of keeping up with the chat. I'm pretty much, all my brain bandwidth is occupied with thinking about the app for now. So let's see what the next step is here. At this point, probably what we want to do is in the exercise page, we want to allow people to configure which parameters their exercises should use. This isn't something that the app can decide for them. So say they create an exercise called pull-ups. Maybe they want to actually have a weight parameter for their pull-ups if they're doing weighted pull-ups, right? Or maybe they want to have weighted pull-ups as its own exercise, whatever. But from the user's perspective, we want to give them the option to add these parameters to whatever exercise they're creating. And so what this is going to look like is we're going to have, well, to kind of keep it simple for now, I might just have some checkboxes where the user can pick, say, this is going to be an assisted exercise, this is going to be a weighted exercise, etc. So let's see what that would look like here. So say we have a input weighted type checkbox, name weighted. And I think that's going to need a label, right? And I think name weighted. Let's see what this looks like. Oh, right. Getting a bit of a complaint here because although I generated the migration, I didn't actually run it. So this is going to actually create those columns in the exercise and sets table in my local database. So now I should be able to refresh the page. Oh, right. Got to rerun the app again. Now refresh the page. And if we edit one of these exercises, there's this weighted checkbox in here. Also, I'm noticing that I didn't update this part of the page to use the Bulma style. So let's actually do that here as well. Like if we sort of copy this business and put that in here. So we've got the name, type text, name, name. And then here we've got this. And let's see if Bulma has anything to say specifically about how to do checkboxes. I'll check that in a moment. Okay, so what's going on here now? So now we've got our name, we've got our weighted thing. And if we look at Bulma, documentation, form, checkbox. How are we supposed to do this? Label class checkbox, input type checkbox. So label class, well, let's do it this way, label.checkbox. And then this. And then this is a text, which I believe was done like that, right? Is that right? Or with a dash? No. Plain text. Okay, so it is with a pipe dealio. Pipe. Something like that. Yeah. But that still doesn't look quite right. What am I missing here? Label class checkbox. Input type checkbox. Seems all right. But should that not go into control? Control, label class checkbox. Oh, one moment. Okay, sorry about that. I'm back. So it seems like that's I guess what it is for now. Not the most handsome, but the idea here is then you can check this off. Let's open the inspect, update. And what we get is weighted on. So this is kind of the logic that we would base our backend, like the controller for this update route is going to check these, whether weighted is set. And if it is, it's going to add a weighted parameter. And we're not going to really allow the user to rename those parameters or anything yet. The backend is, like the database structure is kind of more flexible than what the front end is going to expose. And that's a pretty common pattern, at least for me when I'm working on these apps, because if I wanted to actually make something fully flexible all the way from the front end to the back end, it's kind of complicated. It's work that's not necessarily going to provide any benefit. But if I have an idea of a simple feature like adding this weighted parameter, I also recognize that that's part of a generalized concept of parameters. And so there's sort of a balance there where it's like I want to allow that generalized concept to exist in the database where it's not easy to change later. But in the front end, I'm going to expose like a simpler version of that, see what the user experience for that is like, and then ultimately iterate on that if there's a desire to have, say, multiple types of weighted parameters with different names or whatever. Okay. So one of the things, see, this is another indentation issue. What does it look like now? A little bit better. So this, we're going to have another one for assisted. And another one for distance. And another one for intensity. And then this would be intensity, distance, assisted. And so now if we, and I should change these IDs as well. Assisted, distance, intensity. Pretty simple. Again, if we were using something like React, I would be able to define a component for these, and that would be a little bit easier to go with instead of having to sort of copy paste these things. Pug does have this concept of includes, I believe is the way that you would do it, where you can have basically a piece of the Pug code that you've abstracted into another file, and then you can reuse it in various places. I think mixins maybe is also a thing where, I'm not really familiar with these, but this seems like more of the component style thing maybe. So ultimately, when we start finding ourselves with big blocks of reused code where we don't want to have to maintain them separately, we could start pulling in something like a mixin in order to keep it dry. Don't repeat yourself. Make that easier to maintain. But for now, I'm just going to keep going with the copy-paste approach, I guess you could call it. One thing I do actually maybe want to define a mixin for, though, is this whole form. Because this form is used to edit an exercise, but it's also used to create an exercise. One other option is like over here where we're creating an exercise. Let's actually look at the app here so I can kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. If we go to the Manage Exercises page, we can create a new exercise, right? And we can give it a name and we can add it, but it doesn't let you configure those checkboxes. So there's kind of two patterns we could use here. One is to give a full form when you're creating the exercise where the user can configure everything right there. The other is to basically have the idea that when you create an exercise, you're either only going to specify the name, or maybe you don't even specify anything at all, and you're immediately dropped in to edit that exercise you created with the assumption that you're going to do your configuring there after it's been created, instead of configuring it and creating it at the same time. But for now, as long as these things can be set at all, that's good enough for me, and we can start building out kind of the other side of the functionality on the back end. So again, let's try checking off a couple of these and doing an update. One thing I kind of want to do as just a convenience, my concern here is if I click update right now, it's going to wipe out the name. Let's see what happens. Yeah, must specify a name. And that's, if we look at this post request, the name parameter is empty. And so that's causing an error. And we already know the name, so really we can just fill that in as the value here. And I guess we should be doing that for all of these somehow. Like for checkboxes, is that selected or checked? I'm not really sure what the attribute is to use for that. But for now, if we just do the name, so now this is pre-filled, and I can do update, and we can see that it's checked off those fields. Okay. Now let's look at the back end a little bit. So what we're doing here is posting to /exercises/ID. This is the route that is handling this update operation. And this is where that must specify a name error was coming from. So now we have some other things in the body, right? There's these weighted property, weighted assisted distance, etc. And so what we need to do is set those in here. But what we're actually setting in here is going to be that parameters object. Or I should say parameters array. And so let's define what that is. Probably the simplest way to do this is just some mutable stuff here. So if rec.body.weighted parameters.push name weight ID weight, and what was the other thing we defined there? Data type, and this would be weight. And kind of the idea of the data type is that's going to influence how the parameter is rendered when you're configuring, when you're adding a new set for this exercise. Like if the data type is weight, the user is going to be given an input where they can input some number of pounds or kilograms. If the data type is, distance, we would be expecting them to put in like some distance in miles or kilometers. And here we can actually type this as, let's see, what is this? Parameter definition. This is an array of parameter definitions. And by doing that, if I set this to something that doesn't exist, we're going to get an error. So get a little bit of type checking in there. And then we can do the same things for the others. rec.body.assisted. And yeah, I'm not sure really if there's a value to having these separate IDs or not. The assisted one is an interesting case because here the data type is also weight. The assisted, like I talked about, this is like a negative weight that a person would be having on their exercise, but it's still weight. I'm going to do a quick check in the chat here. Yeah, so kind of the approach that I would take for create and immediately edit would be sending it off to the database for sure. One of the things that I've done in the past is having, like, you could just have a create new exercise button and it immediately creates the exercise with default values for everything. The name could just be like unnamed exercise number 1. And if the user creates another one, that's called unnamed exercise number 2. And they have to go in and edit that in order to give it a proper name and configure the settings on it that they want. You could do it as part of a front-end cache. One of the things I've done in the past in this app, Dust, which uses next.js, so it's a little bit more fancy and kind of magic, but it has all of the state of the app server side and client side, and they're sort of in sync. So here, if you create a new app or a new task for Dust, it's going to create the task client side with sort of like a placeholder ID and information. It's going to dispatch an event to the server, which, using next.js server actions, it's basically just an HTTP request, but dispatches that to the server. You get back a response with the real ID, and then you can update your temporary ID with the real ID. So the response on the client is immediate, but the server is able to then sort of put that in the database and then return with whatever information you need from the server in order to actually update the client state. So there's kind of a few different approaches somebody could take there, but yeah, I would definitely put it in the database for this type of app. Okay, what are our other types here? Distance and intensity. Distance, and data type, distance. And then intensity. Oh, let's just copy this. And the data type intensity, I'm just calling it that for lack of a better name. But basically this data type is going to allow it to be like low, medium, high. And there might be some more generalized term for that, but I feel like intensity works pretty well for now. You could also imagine maybe somebody wanting to do, calling it like difficulty, or even like if you're doing a run, you could have it be called like the incline if you wanted to be able to track whether you're running uphill or not. I don't know, but it's just anything that you would label as low, medium, or high would be using this intensity data type. Okay, so this is actually all we should really need in order to update the database with these values. Let's go ahead and give that a shot. So say I'm in here. I want this to be a weighted exercise, and just for testing purposes, I'm going to check them all off. Update. So those are all set. And now if let's actually open Table Plus here and take a look at what we've created in the database. Yeah, I know what you mean. There's synchronizing client and server state is, it's one of those things where it feels like there's no right option. And that's part of why I try and use the simplest possible option wherever possible, because at least then you're not creating a bunch of tech debt for yourself in the future. That's kind of the advantage a lot of times of having that API focused app and then the client using something like React where it's managing the state on the client, and the server at least is easy to reason about because it's just a RESTful API. And the client side state might be an absolute mess, especially if you have a whole team working on it. But, that's something that you can kind of have a blast radius around. And the server side state is easier to reason about. This particular type of app, though, I do quite like because the server Express is basically managing pretty much all of the state, and we have almost no client-side JavaScript at all. And that makes the client a lot easier to reason about. And the server is not really that much more complicated either. But it does also mean that you have to limit yourself to what's supported by like HTTP, using forms, using redirects and things like that. Like we have, once this exercise is updated, we get redirected back to the exercises page. And so there's a little bit of this leakage in the server about having to know after the user does the update, they're going to want to go back to this page instead of being able to put that logic in the client. So yeah, no silver bullet here, that's for sure. I have used a library in the past called LiveView. It's an Elixir programming language library based on the framework Phoenix. And that basically is like a WebSocket that's managed in the background between the client and the server, and you're able to send events back and forth and kind of seamlessly treat the client and the server as kind of using the same data structures and the same like session state. And it works pretty well. But when I was using LiveView, it was also in the like 0.x versioning, and there were some things that worked, some things that didn't, some things where there was like two ways of doing them, and they both implemented 80% of the functionality, but a different 80%, and it's like nothing quite lined up. So that's another problem, is a lot of the things where it's like theoretically a silver bullet solution, they're pretty new, and they're not actually complete, because it is such a huge problem to solve that it's like a library that really solves the client server state problem is going to be really complicated too. So, okay. Where are we at? I was going to check this exercise. Dumbbell curl. So here we can see our parameters. Can I see these in a, kind of an easier to read way? We've got 4 parameters in here: weight, assisted distance, and intensity. The fact that this is an array is valuable because it can also influence the order that these parameters are rendered when people are editing them. In theory, in the long term, we could allow a user to move these around if they have an exercise with multiple parameters. But for now, they're just in the order that the checkboxes are technically in the order that these if statements are written. So now we have another problem though, which is if we actually look back at this edit page, the values of these checkboxes are not populated at all. So we need to set that. And that shouldn't be too hard. Basically, in this exercise template, we already have access to the exercise object. And so for each of these, for instance, we would say, and I think it's checked. Let's just try that. Checked equals exercise.parameters.find parameter where parameter.id equals weighted. And so what this is saying is check this checkbox if there is a parameter with ID weighted in the exercise. And I think that's how, I think Pug will work with that. But it's not actually updating that, so I'm not sure if that's because of my lack of understanding of how checkboxes are checked. Let's see what this says here. Is it just value? No, I feel like the value is, that's the on. Checked, right. So that is right. So what's the problem here? If I just do this exercise.parameters, is that going to check it? Yes. And so Is it not finding a parameter with the right ID? Oh, because the ID is wait, not weighted. Okay. I should probably make that consistent. Okay, so now that's checked off. And if I, well, let's just do this. If I uncheck it, then refresh the page. Not that you really need to refresh it because we got redirected. We can see it's unchecked. If I check it again, the check persists. Just looking at the chat here. Yeah, the silver bullet stuff it's an easy trap to fall into, especially because each new library, advertises itself that way. And, there's these frameworks where it talks about making web development easy or hiding the complexity or whatever. But, ultimately the complexity is there. And as much as your abstraction tries to hide it, there's almost always going to be something leaky in the mix. So especially like when I'm working on personal projects, I actually like to chase the silver bullet. I like to try new things and see like, is this really going to make it easier or not? But when I'm at work, I like to pick the really robust technology that's been around for 10 years and it's like version 12 and everybody knows the limitations because that's going to be the thing that's ultimately easiest to maintain, easiest to find people to help, to help you maintain, who have experience with it, and often the easiest to understand once you actually start to have to tear apart that abstraction as well. And that's also like why I really like Express, which I am using here, because it's simple and it's well understood and there's tooling for it. And that's a really convenient thing. An example of where like I have been chasing the silver bullet a bit here and it sort of bit me in this app by forcing me to do something I didn't want to do is with authentication, where I'm using this Better Auth library. And I was really surprised after setting up this Better Auth library, which will handle like OAuth provider login. So this app has a GitHub login functionality here. If I sign out, I can sign in and it's using my GitHub credential. And that is really nice. But kind of the weird thing about it is I actually had to use JavaScript for this because there is no other way to actually use this Better Auth app on the client side. It didn't have something where it's like to sign in, send them to this route using these parameters. It's like call this function in our JavaScript library. And that's all the documentation has to say about it. So it's easy, but it's not simple. You know what I mean? It's easy to do, but it's not simple to understand what's actually happening. And as a developer, you don't really have a lot of control. But that's why I ended up actually needing to make like a client side bit of code to do that, despite having tried to avoid JavaScript in the app. Of course, I could totally switch to another library, but I'm not that concerned about it. But it is a bit annoying. And like Next.js is sort of the ultimate example of that for me, where it's like, it makes things easy, but it's anything but simple to understand what's actually going on. And, if you do run into an issue where it's like your data is not being updated when you expect it or something like that, how do you fix that? It can be really hard. And especially if you're actually using like a cloud hosting provider that's Next.js aware, like Versal, it's like I originally deployed my Next.js app to Versal, but it was so magic that there was certain things I just couldn't do. Like I wanted to install a runtime dependency, so I could generate Git SSH keys at runtime, like in the server, but you can't do anything with the server. There's no Docker file. There's nothing. It's just like it automatically deploys it and that's it. So I actually ended up switching to fly.io even for a Next app because at least with Fly, you can configure, a Docker file. Hello. Mm. Transition from Rails to React. That sounds like a nightmare. I've had to do a few things like that in the past, luckily with pretty small apps. But one time I had an ASP.NET application. So this is not, this is in the Microsoft world, and it wasn't using like MVC even. It was like a .aspx file, which is sort of like PHP, where you mix the logic and the HTML into like a single document. And this particular app had like a 2,000 line long ASPX file that had like 90% of the app's logic in it. And I was tasked with modernizing this. And I ended up replacing it with like a single page app on the client side that used Knockout.js, which I actually really liked working with Knockout.js, but it was quite the mess to untangle what that original app did and to try and like actually duplicate that functionality into a totally new framework. And in the end, I had originally tried to maintain the server-side logic of it using MVC, but there was an issue where the sessions on the server were cleared every day. So a user would be filling out their form, and imagine this app is like a really complicated form that the user has to fill out. And then partway through, they would submit it, but the session state had been cleared because the server had just decided to restart itself, which it does every day. And they would lose all their data. And so that's why ultimately we refactored it to totally be client-side so that all the state was in the client. And when the user clicked submit, it didn't rely on any session information, but it was still a huge pain. And that was a one-page app, complicated page, but yeah. Yeah. Docker is a great thing. Docker is one of those things that I didn't actually understand for a few years, but then when I started working on the infrastructure side, I was like, oh, this makes so much sense. Like it actually makes a lot of these infrastructure problems so much simpler. And for me, it's become kind of an expectation where if I'm deploying something to the cloud, it's going to use a Docker file. And it just makes it's so beneficial to have kind of that standard way of describing what your runtime needs to be. Okay, let's update these. This one is assisted. Distance and intensity. And let me make sure that I got those right here. Assisted, distance, intensity. Yeah. Okay, so with that, now if I go back to my manage exercise, I should be able to check off a couple of these, update, and they stay checked off, and I can switch them around. Cool. One of the things about this, though, as I'm actually thinking about it right now, is I could easily see a bug where a user unchecks one of these, and then the exercises that were tracked for that exercise in the past are going to have that parameter specified. Or if they add a new check here, the exercises in the past are not going to have that specified. So we're going to need to make sure to handle that when we render past exercise history, that there's a possibility that these parameters are not going to be present or specified at all if the user's updated this after logging some of the exercises for that, or after logging some sets for that exercise. Yeah, that's a good point. I often don't find that I use Docker files too much locally because I don't know, it just adds complexity, I guess. It gets in my way a little bit, but it is really valuable. One thing I do use here, Podman desktop. This is a Windows computer, so that's why I'm using a tool like this. But basically, for this app, for instance, like my database is just technically a Podman container, but a Docker image. And so I don't have to figure out how to install Postgres or anything like that. I can just run a container. Super nice. I actually have become a fan lately of something GitHub offers called code spaces as well, where you can launch basically a virtual machine in the cloud that then you can install things on and edit your code in and stuff without it ever running on your computer, it doesn't actually use Docker. So that's kind of unfortunate, but it's really convenient to have that, especially like if I'm evaluating an interview candidate's code. Like I don't really want to run that on my computer or my work computer. With code spaces, it's like I can run that code just in the cloud, and very convenient. There are some good new tools. Yeah, it's got integration. If you're using VS Code anyway, it's got integration with VS Code that's basically seamless. But I actually like as well, this is a bit of a tangent, but if we go over here to my code in GitHub, I can create a code space here. And it actually launches basically a code editor, a VS Code style editor right in my browser. So I don't even need to use my local VS Code if I don't want to. And I could be editing my stuff in here and then making commits, and those commits, go back to GitHub, of course. But yeah, you don't get like the full, like there's certain extensions that don't work with it, but it's pretty nice. Anyway, and it's not very expensive either. Okay, so we've got our parameters here. So now what we kind of want to do is when the user is, well, let's actually make a commit before I get too far ahead of myself here. Let's see what we've changed. We've added the ability to specify these parameters when you're updating an exercise. And the same thing here. Okay, so now we want to actually use that in our today view to allow the user to specify values for those parameters when they're creating a new set. And let's see, so I'm going to do a field. I'm just going to kind of copy this pattern here again. Field, and so say like if okay, so this is actually a bit interesting now because we only want to display, like, here's what I'm thinking. Say we have this be weight. We only actually want to display this weight parameter if the exercise chosen in this list is one that has the weight parameter in it. And that's something that we can do server-side potentially, or if the user selects something here, we could reload the page. But probably the best way to do this is by actually introducing some JavaScript. So kind of the idea here is when an exercise is selected, we need some JavaScript that's going to decide what parameters are displayed for that exercise. And for this app, I've been experimenting with a new JavaScript library. So let's look up the docs for that as well. This is a lightweight library for binding signals, they're called, and then using those signals to conditionally do things or do whatever using some data attributes on these HTML elements. That's why it's called data star, because it's like uses the data attribute. And it's kind of similar to like Alpine.js, if you're familiar with that. So kind of what I want to do here is conditionally render an element. So let's see if there's a way to do that here. Expressions, getting started. Oh, reference, probably what I want. Data signals, data computed, data ref, data class, data on, data persist. Don't really want any of those. Data show. Yeah, something like this. So what I would have here is like field data show equals exercise dot something. And so let's actually create that exercise signal. So I believe the way that you do that is with data signals. Let's see what we can see here. Data bind. Yeah, so this would be like select data bind exercise. And then that will create the exercise signal. And this is going to be a little bit annoying here, probably. Let's actually do something just for debugging purposes. If we add a div where we data text exercise, I think it would be how it works. And let's see what that actually looks like. Go to today. Oh, it's not. Oh, whoops. I put a quote in there. Okay. So now if I switch this to something, I'm not seeing that that div. Data bind. What if I do it like this? Again, we're running into the problem of abstractions. Yeah. Kind of chiming in on the chat here. A lot of times, the biggest problem that I see is when you're working with a team and you want everybody to have the same setup. But a lot of times it's like if you're hiring somebody new, they might not have a full level of comfort with the stack to even be able to set it up properly. Or even if they do, how that should be is maybe documented in a page that hasn't been updated in 6 months or something like that. And to actually get everybody with the same development stack can be a real pain. So that's where having something like Docker or, setup tooling. I've worked in places where they actually use Ansible to set up people's development machines. So there's like an actual playbook where that gets run on people's computer and sets it up consistently. You kind of need things like that in order to actually support that problem of having setup at scale. so to speak. And not to mention, I mean, there becomes a whole thing too when you start talking about compliance, where it's like you really have to enforce certain things being installed with specific versions. And if there is a vulnerability that happens, it's like your company might have rules that everybody needs to update to a new version within X days or whatever, and being able to actually manage that automatically. It's not like the developers can't do it themselves, but maybe they don't want to, or they don't notice that they need to do that, or even if they do, it just saves a lot of time to have like a central management kind of tool and to sort of minimize the amount of special stuff that people have to set up on their own computer. Okay, let's see what we've got going on here. Data text exercise. So if I pick something now, still nothing. I wonder how this works with selects. Data bind. I wonder if there's some like debugging thing I can use for this. Basically, I want to see what the value is of the data bind signal. Data bind make. I mean, this is a fairly complicated example compared to what I'm trying to do. I don't think I need to have a model thing defined. And the other thing I'm noticing is like this data show, it actually is showing for some reason. Kind of makes me feel like this signal isn't actually working the way I expect it to work. What a pain. What a pain. Okay, well, I'm going to stop worrying about this for a minute. That's always my approach when there's something I don't understand. Like, let's just think about something else. Instead of trying to deal with this data binding, let's just include all of these for now, and then we can figure out how to hide them later. And this, is fine because even if the user specifies a value in one of these, that value is going to be ignored by the server unless it matches a parameter on the exercise. So the fact that these are shown is bad user experience, but it's not going to cause us to end up with invalid data. And this one is intensity. And then say for weight, this makes sense to have a number. Assistance makes sense to be a number. Distance, I don't know if we want distance to be a number. can you do decimals? Yeah. So I guess that's fine as a number as well. And then intensity is actually going to be a select as well. And this intensity, and we're just going to have 3 options in here. Low, medium, and high. And that's one too many indent. Oops. Okay. Okie doke. So let's just take a look at what this will look like when the user tries to submit something. Okay, so we get the exercise ID, reps, weight, assistance, distance, intensity, date, and order. Yeah, just checking the chat. It's definitely something that you want to get in front of, because otherwise you end up with sort of like the broken window problem, right? Where it's like, if something is already frustrating, then people don't feel motivated to improve it. But if something, like if there is a high quality onboarding experience, then people are more incentivized to maintain that quality experience and not be like the weak link in the chain. Whereas if the whole chain is weak links, then being a strong link doesn't help anybody. And so you kind of need to maintain the quality of all of the links in order to avoid people sort of giving in to despair. Okay, so we did the thing. Let me time check here. Okay, got plenty of time. Usually I'll do about 2 hours. So now let's update our server to parse these values out. We're going to have kind of something similar to, well, actually, it probably won't be that similar. So in this sets, we're going to need parameters again. And in this case, parameters is an object. And this is going back to, if we look at our schema here, for sets, parameters is of type record, string, string, or number. And that's what we're constructing here. And then we're going to pass it into our set that we're creating. And the way this object is going to work is the key of the object is the ID of the parameter that we're setting a value for. So if we look back down here, there's weight, assisted, distance, intensity. Weight, assisted, distance, intensity. And there's a few ways that I could do this, but I feel like this is going to be okay for now. And so weight would be like rec.body.weight. And the same for the others. Distance, intensity. And here, we could just do this and then like filter out the parameters to only be ones that the exercise supports. Or we could build this up with like 4 separate if statements. Or we could do something a little bit fancy where it's like, don't need that and, exercise dot parameters dot find So if there is a weight parameter, then we'll include this weight value. Otherwise, we won't. And what's it complaining about? Oh, this should be not that exercise, because that exercise is just the ID. We actually need to look up the actual exercise from the database. And if we look down here, we should have some code that's doing that. And I'm going to put this in a helper function here, now that I'm writing it twice. The exercise ID is a number, and the user ID is a string. And we can just return the value. And make sure to import this. And for some reason, Copilot doesn't, or VS Code TypeScript, I mean, doesn't detect that that actually is an import. And this is a user ID. And then this is just the ID. And, you know, the reason that this needs the user ID as well is because we don't want the user to be able to get exercises for other users. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for stopping in. So we need to make sure to specify both the user ID and the ID here to avoid authorization mishaps, which is also a big reason of why I want to put that into a function. So then this would be exercise is await get exercise ID user.id, and then this has to be parse inted. Oops. Okie doke, something like that. And then I'm going to do the same thing up here to actually get that exercise data. And this, I will rename this to avoid confusion. Okay, and then this is complaining about the fact that that's possibly null, which is very true. And then we're going to do this same pattern for assisted distance and intensity. Oops. And let's save so that gets formatted. Okay. Distance. Intensity. Okay. Just kind of looking through this. I think that's pretty much what we want. And, you know, again, this code is a little bit repetitious. If I was making a PR or like actually trying to make this code production ready, you could say, I would probably try and abstract this into a function or something. Not that there's strictly a problem with it the way it is, but the more repetition you have, the easier it is to have typos. It's not necessarily obvious that all of these parameters work the same way or what the difference is between them. And so by abstracting it into a function, it becomes that much more clear what, and maybe I'll just do that as an example. So like, for instance, if I do maybe parameter, this would take the ID, which is a string, and it's going to return this without the ... And I guess we don't need that either. And then this would be p.id equals ID. This is also the ID. And then this is also the ID. And so this kind of makes the relationship between those different parts of the code really explicit. And then for each of these things, we would just do maybe parameter, weight, assisted, distance, and intensity. And that cleans it up a lot. Okay, so let's go ahead and add a quick console.log in here so we can see the value that we're computing. And just to remember, what exercises have we set for dumbbell curl? There's weighted, assisted, and intensity parameters. So if we try to add a dumbbell curl with all of these set, we should see that weight, assistance, and intensity are going to be added to the parameters, but distance is not. Let's see what we got. Yeah, weight, assistance, and intensity. The assisted one now, this is a bit interesting because we found that there was the assisted parameter, but there wasn't an assisted value in the body. So is there a mismatch there? Yes, because here I call it assistance, and here I call it assisted. So let's try and make this consistent. Assisted should be assisted, and weight should be weight. So let's go over here, assisted, assisted. And try it again. And now, yeah, we see weight, assisted, and intensity. Cool. So now users have the ability to specify these things when they're creating sets. One of the other things I want to do, we have these sets. Technically, let's look at our today page here. We're iterating over the sets and kind of rendering just the ID for each set because I didn't want to figure out exactly how to render the information for each set. But it's probably about time to start tackling that now. And we could just do something really simple, but it might be nice to actually pull in a Bulma component here to make these sets look half decent as well. My feeling is that this is probably going to be a good opportunity to have cards again. And I try to avoid overusing cards because they do, like, they're not the most efficient use of screen real estate versus something like a table. And just for me personally as a user, I find cards kind of annoying. But it does give us a decent option to get started with here, and then we can make something more complicated later if we feel like it. So let's actually just copy. See, one of the problems with Pug that I don't really like is that I can't just copy these examples straight up. I have to reconstruct them. But that's all right. Let's get rid of that UL. So we've got a card header would be set.exercise.name, say. And this isn't actually going to work yet. For now, I'll just do set.exercise. And then we're going to have the content, card content. and this is going to be something. I'll probably just have this be the set.parameters. Let's just say that for now. And it's not going to be pretty, but we'll at least be able to see it. And let's actually do it like this. Content, a paragraph with the set parameters, a paragraph with reps. I want to embed well, let's just do it this way. So like set.reps plus reps. Okay, and then we can also add like a footer here. Footer.card footer. And then this is going to have some buttons in it. And let's look back at this exercises list here. So yeah, let's just copy something like this. You know, I'm probably not going to implement this right now, but we could have like a delete set. For example. And we could also have like an edit set. And really, the way that we actually want to do this is going to start to get a bit complicated. Again, we have to think about if we want to use JavaScript versus using server-side logic. So for example, when you're editing a set, if somebody clicks edit on the set, should that redirect them to this same page with like a new query parameter where it's like today editing equals 1, 2, 3, and then set 1, 2, 3 would include the editing tab where that's handled on the server side. Or if the user clicks edit, should that actually use JavaScript to mutate the DOM to change the contents of one of the set cards into a little form? Not sure. For now, we're just going to have them redirect to nowhere. And let's see what that looks like. Card header. So this, the headers are looking weird. Oh, because I need to have a card header title. Of course. Like that. Yeah. And this would be, I might as well JSON.stringify, set parameters. And by doing it that way, we'll be able to see the, I guess I don't really need that, but whatever, that's fine. This will let us see the parameters. And in theory, we're going to want to render these in a better way. But for now, this at least lets us see what they are. Okay, so the one other thing we see here is this set.exercise. We really want this to be something like set.exercise.name. But in order to do that, we need the set.exercise to not just be the ID, but actually be like a populated value. So let's see what that would look like here. We're looking at the sets page. And, or no, we're looking at the today page. And this is loading all these sets. So one of the things that I could do here is make a new function for this as well. Let's make a new file, sets. async function get sets for day. And then there's going to be date, string, user ID, string. And so we're going to do something like this. And we're going to need to import all this stuff. And this is date. And so kind of the trick here now is we're going to need to do a join on sets table.exercise to retrieve the exercise information as well. But not really a join, because like a join will combine those columns together into one big table that has the columns from both tables. But what we want is for that exercises, or pardon me, that exercise property to actually be the object from the exercise table. And I'm assuming there's a way to do that in Drizzle. Let's see. Let's look at query here, and then include relations. Sounds promising. With. Oh, so this is interesting actually, because this is not even using the select. Like I'm using db.select, and this here is using db.query. I didn't realize that there was like a whole separate option for that. Let's try using this db.query approach instead. So this would be something like db.query, which is not a function. Dot users, or no, dot sets, dot find many. I don't understand what that's trying to tell me. db equals drizzle schema. Drizzle. Okay, so well, I didn't include that. Maybe I need to do that. And that would be kind of like this, or something like that. Okay, and so then this is like looking for sets table, which a little awkward, but okay. And then find many, and it would be like with exercise true. Huh. Okie doke. And then when I'm doing find many here, how do I filter? Okay, just with a where. And we already have the where clause here, so we can just plunk that there. Let's see what this does. And this user ID thing, I don't know why that didn't. Oh, see that? automatic import wasn't right. And then we also need the order by. And the reason the order by is important, let's look back at the index here, this code that we deleted. Where did we delete that? Maybe I didn't delete it yet. If we look at the today page, yeah, order by ascending sets table.order. And the reason we need this is so that the sets are displayed in the right order in the UI, of course, but also so that this logic in the today page, checking the next set order, is actually going to work. Okay, so we've got this function here. Let's go ahead and replace this with that. Get sets for day. And we're going to have the date, which is today, and user.id. And let's log those. Okay, refresh the page. It's not happy about something, that's for sure. Let's see here. My assumption is it's something to do with this width. So let's get rid of that and see if we get an error or not. Okay, so see, now we don't get an error, but it's not populating the exercise, which is kind of the whole point of using this type of query. So sort of the issue or like one potential issue here is I don't know if with only works with like one-to-many or many-to-many relationships, or it also works with like this thing where the exercise is just in a single ID. It's yeah, I guess that is a one-to-many as opposed to a many-to-one. Or does that have to be like exercise ID? No. Does it have to be like exercises table? No. I mean, this is where, again, we're kind of getting bit by some magic here. As usual, when I get bit by magic, my approach is to kind of switch to something that's less magic, something a little simpler. So what we can do here is actually do this second query ourselves. And what this is going to be is like get exercise. And we already have this helper function to get exercise, so that's convenient. Set.exercise, user ID. And this, what is you complaining about? Oh, this should be exercise ID, right? No. Oh. Right. So this needs to be inside a for loop. For set of sets, set.exercise equals exercise. And that should be sets. And now this is going to complain because the type here is not right. So I could do a map, and that might make TypeScript a little happier. Sets with exercises equals sets.map set. And then this would be async. And kind of the annoying thing about this is because we have to make that async, we also have to like await promise.all here. And this would be like return ... set exercise like so. And so now the type for this sets with exercise object is just like the type for the set, except the actual exercise property is an object that is the exercise. Oh, don't want. Yeah. And then we would return that. So I'm just going to return that. And so then here, we log our sets. If we refresh the page again, refresh. What's the problem here? What is the problem here? Okay, so it is getting there. Okay, so that's actually working. So now we can actually see the name of the exercise in the, the set title here. Let's get rid of these console logs. Probably have a few of them around now. Get rid of this. Get rid of this. Okay. Let's do some commits before we get too crazy. So this get exercise function that was associated with this chunk as well. So we're going to stage that range. And this is going to be extract get exercise logic into a function. Then we've got another one here, same kind of thing. Extract get sets or day logic into a function. And, we could argue about the granularity of these commits, but I'm not too concerned about it because of the lack of collaboration on this project. Like if I had a bunch of other people I was working with here, I might be a little bit more careful about these commits, but I'm not too concerned about it at the moment. Okay, and then we're going to add this, I guess, all of this. So this is going to be, let's actually do this part. And the today page, there's no other updates we need for that. So this is going to be render cards for each set in today page. And then what's left is updating the sets. So like these code changes are in this post/sets route, which is used to create sets. And what this is allowing the user to do is specify parameter values for their sets. Okay. Time check here. Okay, we're looking at maybe 20 minutes left. So now we have some of these other things to deal with. Do we want to implement these buttons? Might as well. Here's what I'm thinking. The delete button should be fairly easy to implement without any client-side code. So let's start with that. The delete button. So for example, if we look down here at this function, this is the same kind of pattern that we're going to want to do for sets. And ultimately, I'm going to probably start pulling some of these routes out into subfiles, but for now, let's just keep trucking along with what we have here. So this is going to be a route to delete a set. So it's going to delete from sets table, where sets table.user, and yeah. So what this is doing, it's going to delete from the sets table, but only if the user on that set matches the user ID of the logged in session. So again, we're not allowing the user to delete sets or users other than themselves. This is enforcing our authorization rule. And then we're going to redirect them back to the today page because that's where this functionality exists. So now if I click one of these delete buttons, what happens? Sets 5 delete. Okay, so the problem here is it's trying to do a get, which is not what I want. And this could be a get, and that wouldn't really be a problem, but it doesn't feel quite right. I would rather have it be a post, because that kind of better expresses the intent of the route. In fact, it could even be a delete. But the reason that I don't have this as a delete is because the HTML form submission doesn't allow you to actually specify delete. So we're kind of going to be doing this pattern here. Let's copy this, and we're going to render one of these things for each card in the today page. Let's just do this. Dunk, dunk. And this would be card footer item. And this would be sets, set.id, delete. Let's see if that looks even remotely half decent here. Not in the slightest. What does that look like? I mean, still bad. Still pretty bad. How do I... So the kind of the problem that I'm running into here is like I want this form, but the form, like the card footer class, card footer item, I want it on the button inside the form, not on the form itself. Let me look at MDN here and see if I can actually use the button. I wonder if this is possible. Like, so one thing is I could have a form owner be in a different place. Is there a way to do it without a form? Not really. Okay. So what I would kind of need to do here is almost like this. Like you have the form, and then this is like a button card footer item. And the form ID is going to be delete plus set.id. And then down here, this would be like form ID, or what is it? Just form. Let's see what that looks like. Doesn't look like anything. Oh, because I have to have this be delete. Since I changed it from an input type submit to a button. Let's see how this looks. So now we've got the delete button. And if we inspect this, it's form delete 5. And in this card, we actually have that form delete 5, which describes the action that should happen when that button is pressed. Let's see if it works. Delete. And it's gone. I can delete this one too. Delete. And it's gone. Okay, so that's pretty much working how I would hope. Again, the styling is not quite perfect, but it's good enough for me. So this should be basically all one granular commit here. Add ability to delete sets in today page. Okay. So with that, we have a couple things to think about now. Let me do a quick time check. Okay, plenty of time. So now we could implement this edit functionality if we wanted. And I might actually go ahead and do that. So I'm thinking I'm going to implement that edit functionality with a server-side query parameter impacting the templating logic, just because that seems like the simplest path forward to me right now. So what's that going to look like in our today page? We're going to want something like the card content is going to be conditional. If editing set equals set.id, then we'll do this. Well, no, then we'll do something, which we'll just put a placeholder in there for now. Else we'll do that. And I think that's how you do conditionals in Pug, right? Yeah. Okay, so there should be no change because this editing set is not set. So let's do that. We're going to need to go up here and we're going to want a new parameter passed to the template called editing set. And that parameter is going to be pulled from the query parameters to this method call, or to this controller method, I mean. So if we do like const editing set equals rec.query.editing set. The other thing is this is going to be a string. So to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about here, let's actually do it. So this set here, what ID is that? So purely for testing purposes, I'm going to go ahead and add the ID here. Set.id. So we can see this is set ID 7. So if we pass in editing set equals 7, nothing happens. And the reason nothing happens is that query parameter, even though the value is numeric, is being, sent to the JavaScript as a string. Like Express doesn't know necessarily that there's a number in there. So we need to make sure to parse that out into an integer so that when we actually compare it with the set ID, which is a number, this equality will be true. I mean, another thing, I wonder if I just got rid of one of the equals. Is that going to fix it? Yeah, so that fixes it by using the JavaScript non-strict equality. But we want to use the triple equals just because it's more standard, more predictable. And so we need to parse this into an integer for that to work. And we're going to get an error here because this is possibly undefined. So, we could say if it exists, then parse it to a thing. Otherwise, just leave it as undefined. And now what are you complaining about? So now it's complaining about the possibility of this actually being an array. And that, for instance, if I do like this and editing set equals 8, now that value in Express is going to be an array. But we don't really want that. So let's actually just do a quick check. Res.status 400.send cannot edit multiple sets at once. And this is just protecting us from basically the user either manually editing the query string, or if we have a bug in our code that causes that to happen. And so now this is it's not well, what is parsed QS? What even is that? It's a more complex query parameter. Query parameters are complicated, man, I tell you. Okay, so now, let's get rid of that. So now this one is being edited. So now we want to actually allow the user to do that with this edit button. So this is going to be a link to the current page with just the query parameters changing, and we're setting editing set equals set.id. Right? Let's refresh the page. Let's actually get rid of that. So now if we click edit, we're sent back to the same page, but with this query parameter, and so we're shown the editing form for this set. Simple enough so far. Now we need to actually put the editing form in there. And again, I'm going to do some copy pasting here. Paste. And then this all gets indented. And here's another example where, I just copy pasted a big block of code. If that was a mix-in, that might be kind of nice. but I'm not going to worry about that quite yet. And then here, I'm actually going to do a piece of logic. If editing set, then we're going to do something else. We're going to do this. And if the set is being edited, we're actually going to put a button here, which is going to be submit, a submit button for the form. Edit. And so this form up here is going to need an ID, edit dash plus set.id. And so when the user clicks this submit button in the footer, let's get rid of these white space things because they're confusing me. Then that's going to submit that. And that submission, you know, we have to handle that on the back end still. But for now, let's just go with what we've got here. And so we don't really need I mean, I guess we could let the user change the exercise still. What we don't need is the today and the order because the user is not going to be able to change those. And for each of these fields, we're going to need a value, which is like set.reps and so on. Value set.parameters dot weight, set.parameters dot assisted, and set.parameters dot distance. And then same thing here, I guess. Dot intensity. And that's going to make sure to populate those default values. And we're going to do the same thing here. Set.name or set.exercise.id. Right? I wonder, yeah, we're going to get a problem. Oh, so it doesn't like this. Let's get rid of that. Refresh. Okay. So now, you know, if we get rid of that, we have our set. If we click edit, we get a form to edit the set. And these values are pre-populated, which actually, let's go back here. So there's a weight and an assisted and an intensity medium. If we go forward, we see the reps, weight, assistance, but the intensity isn't being hydrated from the data. So I think this value property on the select probably doesn't work, in which case we would need something like this, selected equals low. Is that a thing? And if I just do this on the medium one, I'm curious to see if this detects the medium intensity. Oh yeah, right. Gotta get rid of that. Okay, so now it's detecting that medium intensity. So I'm going to do the same thing here for high. High. And then we also need to do the same thing up here, which is option selected equals set.exercise.id equals exercise.id. Get rid of this. And so now if we refresh this, that exercise should be dumbbell curl. Yep. And now let's, the action here, we need to have this be sets / plus set.id. And basically this is going to do a post to the set ID to update it with these new values when an update happens. Let's just try it and see what it says. Let's open the network tab, submit. And it's not going to do anything because we haven't actually defined that route. We scroll down here. It's not saying it, but that route set ID is not defined. But what this is doing is it should be doing a post with exercise 13, reps 1, 2, 3, weight 1, 2, 3, assisted distance, and intensity medium. And so if I were to change this to like 1, 2, 3, 4, then it's going to update that. Okay. And I need to get rid of that add button. And it should do the same thing when I click. Let's refresh. Refresh the page. If I click submit, it should do the same thing as well. Submit. Yes. Okay. So again, far from perfect here, but we're making progress. Now we need to define a new route to update an existing set. So this would be sets/id. And for this one, we're going to get the reps. Well, we'll get the exercise. We don't need the date or order. And then we can kind of copy this logic as well. Which, I mean, it's already there. And instead of inserting, we're going to be updating set those values where, and, where what? It's going to be this again. Where, okay, ID, I need to put in here const ID equals rec.params.id. So what are we doing? When this route is hit with a post, we're going to parse some things out of the request.body, the exercise ID, and the number of reps. We're also constructing this parameters object by parsing these other things out of the request body. ID, user ID, yeah. And then we're updating the database, or in the database, we're going to update the set. We're going to set, okay, we don't want to do that. No point updating the user because that can't change. All we can update here is the exercise, the reps, and the parameters. And then we're only going to do that for one, at most one record where it matches the set ID and it also matches the user ID. So the user can't update sets for people other than themselves. And, again, we're looking at some pretty duplicative logic here. So ultimately, I might want to try abstracting this into a helper function. Trying to think about that. I do think that would be useful, but for now, let's just see how well it works. Let's go to the Today page. And, pretend we're a user. We want to edit this set because actually this was a low intensity set. Let's switch it to low. Submit. And we can see what happened here is we did this post. And then we got redirected to the Today page because of this line at the bottom of the post. And our intensity was updated to low. And we can also see, like, say I go over to manage exercises edit. Maybe I don't even want intensity on here at all anymore. Let's get rid of that. And then if I go back to the today page, I edit this. Because we don't have the JavaScript to filter out that field in the UI, it's still going to be there. But no matter what value I put in intensity, when I submit this, let's change something to illustrate. Change those. Submit. And it just updated now the weight and the assisted weight. The intensity is gone. So we can see that the filtering there is working as we expected. Let's make a commit for these changes as well. So we've got, it's all part of the same piece of, all part of the same feature, you could say. Add the ability to edit sets, to edit existing sets data. Okay. And we're a little bit over time, so it's probably a good stopping point. Let's close this out, push our changes. And yeah, that'll be it. Thanks, y'all. I'll see you next week.